Welcome everyone to today's Che Alaska webinar, which is titled Towards a Global Plastic Treaty, Who Has a Seat at the Table? Before we get started, I want to note that we will have a live Spanish interpretation for this webinar. So I will hand it over to our interpreter, Felipe, to explain more about the logistics of that now.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Hola a todos. Buenos días o buenas tardes, dependiendo de dónde se nos estén uniendo. My name is Felipe, and together with Angie, we will be your simultaneous interpreters or live translators, which is the same thing, today. Soy Felipe y junto con mi colega Angie vamos a ser los intérpretes simultáneos o traductores en vivo y en directo, que es lo mismo. So to connect to interpretation, if you're using a computer, you'll find an icon in the shape of a globe that says interpretation at the bottom of your screen. Click on it and then click on English. And if you're using a tablet or a smartphone, scroll all the way to the end of the menu at the bottom of your screen. You'll find 3 dots. Tap on those, then tap on language interpretation, and then tap on English, and then tap on done. Si ustedes están utilizando un computador, en la parte inferior de su pantalla van a encontrar un globo que dice interpretación, ahí debajito. Le hacen clic y le hacen clic en español. Y si están utilizando una tablet o un teléfono celular, tienen que desplazarse hasta el final del menú en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Allí encontrarán 3 puntitos. Hagan clic ahí, luego hacen clic en español y luego hacen clic en listo o done. Y con eso ya estarán listos para escuchar la interpretación o la traducción en vivo y en directo de todo lo que se diga en inglés a español. One last reminder, please everyone speak at a moderate pace and we will be monitoring the chat if you happen to have any questions. Estaremos monitoreando el chat por si tienen alguna pregunta. Les pedimos el favor que si van a participar lo hagan hablando pausadamente. That's it from us, Sarah. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Felipe. My name is Sarah. I'm the Communications Coordinator with Alaska Community Action on Toxics, or ACAT. And Che Alaska is a program of ACAT and Collaborative for Health and Environment. And it's also part of Che's broader international coalition of over 5,000 individuals across the globe. So I invite you to introduce yourself and where you're zooming in from in the chat if you'd like to. Today's webinar will be a panel-style discussion, and we'll also have an audience Q&A portion. So please feel free to send in your questions using the Q&A box feature. We'll be closing the chat function once the discussion begins, but you'll be able to send in your questions at any point throughout the webinar with the Q&A feature. And at the end, we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. I'll just give a brief overview or background for today's webinar. As we've all seen, plastic pollution and overproduction isn't just an environmental issue, it's a global crisis that's harming human health, human rights, biodiversity, and the climate. Currently, there are ongoing negotiations through the UN to develop a global plastics treaty, and this is really a critical opportunity for bold global action to create a legally binding agreement that is addressing the full life cycle of plastics and its impacts to health and human rights. So the process started with the first International Negotiation Committee, or INC, meeting in 2022, and now we're approaching INC 5, which is the final scheduled session before the treaty is expected to be adopted early next year. And Che has hosted lots of discussions leading up to each of these meetings that focus on the key issues that have arisen throughout the process. And you can find recordings of these conversations on the webinar page for today's event, and we can drop those links in the chat as well. But for today's conversation, we're zeroing in on the question of stakeholder engagement and specifically how communities impacted by plastics and the scientists who study those health effects have been able to participate in the treaty process. And in between negotiating sessions, those involved in the treaty have been doing lots of intersessional work, and now they're deep into preparations for INC 5, which starts on the 25th of this month. So we're extra grateful to our speakers for making the time to join us today during this really busy time period. So I'll go ahead and introduce our three panelists for today's webinar. We have Yuyun Ismawati. She is the co-chair of IPEN, the International Pollutants Elimination Network, and she is a co-founder and senior advisor of the Nexus 3 Foundation. Frankie Arona is executive director of the Society of Native Nations, and he actively works on the Global Plastics Treaty as a member of the U.S. Environmental Justice Delegation and the Indigenous Peoples Major Group with the UN Environmental Program. And then we have Dr. Martin Wagner, who is an associate professor for environmental toxicology at the Norwegian University for Science and Technology. And he works on the Plastics Treaty as a member of the Scientist Coalition as well. And joining me in moderating today's discussion is Kristen Schaefer. She's the director of CHE, and she will be leading our panel Q&A. So thank you to all of our speakers for being here. And now I will turn it over to you, Kristen.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. And thank you all for joining us for today's discussion. I also want to echo Sarah's appreciation and gratitude to our panelists for taking the time out at this very busy time leading up to INC 5 to have today's discussion with us. Again, this will be a panel discussion, and we will have time at the end for a Q&A. So please feel free to drop your questions at any point during the discussion in that Q&A box. So we're going to go ahead and dive in. So I'm going to, our first question is about just asking each of our panelists to share a little bit more about your work on this topic specifically and your engagement in the plastics treaty negotiations. And also what you will be focusing on at this upcoming meeting. And we'll start with Yuyun. Yuyun?
Yes. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Chair, for organizing this discussion. I'm Yuyun Ismawati. I'm the co-chair of IPEN, also co-founder and senior advisor of Nexus 3 Foundation based in Indonesia. I'm joining the call now from the UK. Where I've been a resident for since 2010. My interest and my focus of involvement in this treaty will be looking at the health aspects and the chemicals of concerns, especially, and how the treaty will come into agreement to cut the production, because that is our main problems, main challenge this in the last 20 years, and how we will have a more meaningful treaty, not downgraded to only plastic waste treaty or chemicals in products, plastic products treaty. We don't want that. We want to have an ambitious treaty, so we will make sure that all parties, all delegates will be approached and have the same strong ambitions than the same as us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Yuyun. Thank you so much for your important work on this. Martin, the same question to you. Share a little bit more about your engagement and also what you'll be focusing on at this upcoming meeting.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for the invitation. Glad to be here. And good evening from Norway. I'm Martin Wagner. I'm a scientist. I'm a biologist. I've been studying the impact of plastics on human health and the environment for about 2 decades now, in particular focusing on microplastics and nanoplastics, but also on all the chemicals that are leaching from all the plastics that we're using every day. So for me, I think I engaged in the treaty really because I see the treaty as like the culmination of all the years of research that the scientific community has been doing. So I think that provides quite strong incentive for us to engage in that process. And as Sarah mentioned, I'm part of the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Treaty. I'm not speaking on behalf of the coalition today, but I'm an active member of that amazing group of scientists from all across the globe that are working towards an ambitious global treaty on plastics, but that are also who are also working on bringing in the science in that process, and we talk more about that later. My priorities indeed for the hopefully final round of negotiations of the treaty will be rather driven by my science. It will be on microplastics and nanoplastics, but in particular chemicals of concern in plastics, of which there are many. And attached to that is also the issue of transparency around plastic materials and products. That's very important to me. But I just want to say, as broader scientist coalition, of course, we have a whole host of key elements that we want to see in an ambitious treaty for which there's good scientific evidence. They should be in a treaty, and we're working together to make those happen. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Frankie, same question to you. An overview of your engagement with the treaty and what you'll be focusing on at the end of this month in South Korea.
Yeah. Haku. Good day to everyone. Thank you for having me on the webinar. I'll just pretty much say ditto to everything that's already been said. No, I will just add to what's already been said. Once again, I'm Frankie with Society of Native Nations. I'm environmental liaison for my tribal chief of the Gabalimo peoples of San Gabriel Mission in the LA Basin, and I'm also with the Break Free from Plastics and U.S. Environmental Justice Delegation, and I co-chair for the Indigenous Peoples Major Group with UNEP. And I'll say for generations, Indigenous peoples and frontline communities have been fighting against the human rights violations inflicted upon our health and environment. We have actively participated in the global negotiations since INC 1, and before that process even started, right, in other frameworks, and addressing the plastics crisis within the broader context of chemical and waste issues in various UN frameworks. The unchecked expansion of plastic production by the petrochemical industry, both in the US and globally, that has dramatically escalated over 2 decades, is where we are demanding accountability not only from corporations but also from governments who enable these harmful practices, this violence and harm on our communities, and governments must cease perpetuating that corporate abuse that prioritizes profit over the well-being of people and the planet, and lead with safeguards for human health and the environment. We're in a human rights crisis, and these are violations, and they need to be addressed. And so we try to find our space, in these negotiations where it's been unequitable, so yeah, I'm looking forward to this very interesting conversation, and the many that I'm sure all of us have had over the last few months. I'm sure this is probably like the 3rd or 4th webinar this month for everyone. So yeah, look forward to it. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here, and thanks to all of you for the important work you're doing at this moment leading into this final discussion. So let's dive right into that question of who's had a seat at the table during the process of these negotiations. So we'll start, Frankie, with you. Do you feel you and your constituency have had a meaningful seat at the table throughout these negotiations? And if not, what have the hurdles to real engagement and real impact been?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll say, as an Indigenous representative, an advocate for frontline and defense line communities, the answer is a resounding no. We don't really feel like we have a seat at the table. We have not had a meaningful seat at the table of the plastics treaty negotiations, while other voices are slowly becoming louder. Our concerns and traditional and Indigenous knowledge are often marginalized or ignored, right, and streamlined through because of the hurdles that we continue to face to have real engagement, like limited access to the resources necessary to do so, the tokenistic inclusion, the language and cultural barriers, the lack of recognition of Indigenous and traditional knowledge, and the power dynamics between those disproportionately impacted and government and industry in the negotiations, right? So from a human rights perspective, which is how we've kind of led with in these negotiations, these kinds of exclusions, I should say, I'm sorry, exclusions is unacceptable. The right to participate in decision-making processes that affect one's life and environment is a fundamental human right. The continued marginalization of Indigenous people and frontline communities and the plastic treaty negotiations is a violations of that right. We demand, so we have worked really hard to demand a genuine seat at the table, not as observers, but as rights holders. It's our voices, our knowledge, and our lived experiences that must be central to the development of any treaty that aims to address the global plastics crisis. Anything less is a continuation of a systemic injustice that has plagued our communities for generations and for far too long. So that, that's what I would say about, the inclusion that we continue to fight for in these negotiations. It has been a struggle since INC 1 with trying to get interventions in to be seen as rights holders, those that hold the lived experiences that can tell you what has worked and what hasn't worked for generations, need to have a seat at the table, much more so than industry, those that had caused the problem in the first place, by putting profits over the well-being of human health and the environment. So that would be my answer to that question.
Yeah, no, that's powerful. And it's it's the process and the kind of rules of the game, how things are set up that seem kind of nuts and bolts. It's not really the content of the negotiations, but it is absolutely critical to moving forward toward a solid plastics treaty in the end. Yuyun, what about you? I know your network works a lot with communities in the global south who are directly impacted by plastics in all kinds of ways, all across the life cycle. What's your thought on kind of the engagement in this treaty and whether folks who are directly impacted have had a meaningful seat at the table?
Thank you, Christine. It's a bit tricky, this one. In this treaty, the negotiation. I'm representing a public interest NGO and also the IPEN network, mostly public interest NGOs, where we work with local communities, local actors, and extend their voice when they do not have the opportunity to voice, to express their concerns. The participation in the plastic treaty negotiation has been restricted or less flexible than other negotiation processes. I joined the Minamata Convention negotiation since the beginning, since 2008 until 2013 and until now. But there was no restriction at the Minamata Convention negotiations. But in this plastic treaty, there are lots of restrictions and limitations. Only X number of us allowed to be registered under one organization. And then we didn't have the opportunity to speak, or freedom to speak, at the regional meetings, because the issue is so contentious that our region, Asia Pacific, are very restricted, and many delegates, member states from oil producing countries and petrochemical producers do not want us in the room, which was never happened before. So we were excluded from even from regional consultation. And when they gave us time, it's only 1 hour or 2 hours, and it's limited. Only one person can raise a question, or from one organization or two. So we have to submit our questions first before we raise the questions. So this is really not participating, not inclusive, and it's not easy to speak to our delegates with that restriction. So in some way, some of our colleagues managed to be able to be part of the member states delegates, but that's also with some restrictions. So I think in general, the main hurdle is the resistance from petrochemical countries to have observers in the discussions, because they do not want us to raise too many concerns. However, they gave also spaces for corporates, for representative of petrochemical industries to be in a space, and some of them also become the member of the delegates, official delegates, and that sounds ridiculous, but we can have a discussion later. But that's how I see it. There are restrictions and limitations, so we are not as flexible as in other treaty negotiations to express our concern.
Thanks so much for sharing that experience. Martin, turning to you, you've been part of the Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty, as you mentioned. So what's been the experience of that coalition and of you as a scientist in engaging in this treaty and having a seat at the table?
Yeah, indeed, I'm just adding to the struggles here, which were similar but a bit different for scientists, I would say. And the challenges we faced in taking part in the INC process was twofold. In the beginning, even though all member states and all UN institutions really called for a lot of science to inform the treaty, and it all needs to be science-based and evidence-based, etc., there was no official route for scientists to take part in the negotiations. Simply because in the UN system, and that was quite surprising to me to learn, in the UN system, universities are considered government entities, institutions. And since the governments already participate in the negotiations, there can't be extra governments, i.e. universities, participating. So we couldn't just like register as observers in those negotiations. So what we had to do was piggybacking on civil society and asking them for providing us with one of their spare seats in their delegations, in their observer delegations. And that was indeed amazing, and it worked well for many of us, but it was also uncomfortable in such that you're wearing a badge of a civil society organization while you're representing science, right? You're not representing their views, etc. So I feel that was kind of problematic in the beginning, since we had like a lot of conversations, wrote a lot of letters, exchanges with UNEP and the UN system, and they loosened the rules a bit. So now, and that's maybe a good outcome, universities and research institutes are allowed to kind of accredit themselves as observers, making it a bit more easy for scientists to contribute. The second struggle that we were facing is that for us, taking part in these negotiations is a hobby, is a side job, right? So it's not part of our everyday job. So all of us are doing that on the side, on top of their day jobs. And I don't want to moan, but I just want to say that like we had to kind of finance the travels to all these meetings from our own pockets, etc. And that made it incredibly hard for researchers from the Global South to take part. We organized some funding to bring some of them in, but it's quite exclusive for scientists from countries that are most heavily affected by plastic pollution to take part. And I found that quite frustrating. There's more struggles. I think that we all experienced as observers there. There was very limited time for observers to speak at those meetings. Usually there was a long kind of speakers list of 50, 60 organizations. Usually we had about 20 minutes to hear them. So I feel like there wasn't a lot of public space for observer organizations, including scientists. And that was kind of frustrating as well. So I feel like many scientists were part of the negotiations. We forced our way into these negotiations, and I think that's quite a good kind of outcome, at least from my perspective. But it wasn't simple. Just stopping there for the time being.
Going the extra mile to make it happen. I have a follow-up question. Martin, you mentioned that transparency was going to be one of the things you're focusing on in this upcoming meeting, and that's certainly adjacent to effective engagement, right? And I'm wondering, how can civil society push for more transparency in these negotiations? And is there a role for public pressure on this issue?
Well, as a scientist, I'm a citizen and I'm part of civil society in general, but I don't have like strong kind of views on how we can push for more transparency in those processes other than implementing strong conflicts of interest rules, right? So we heard already that some lobbyists made it in the national delegations of some member states, right? And these kind of conflicts of interest were not disclosed and are not disclosed today as well. So I think like pushing for transparency in such that who is a person taking part in that negotiation coming from, who's paying for for their salaries, etc., and what are their conflicts of interest. I think disclosing that is particularly important. I think like one of the major challenges in the plastics treaty indeed was the timeline, right? So of course, if there was more time allocated to negotiate the treaty, probably there would have been better ways of engaging stakeholders, scientists, etc. But I think like everything was done under so much pressure, and that's actually good, right? We want a plastics treaty really fast, but I think that's kind of resulting in collateral damage on participation, which should not be, I think.
Yeah, interesting. Pluses and minuses. It's an urgent problem, so we want to move quickly, but then a streamlined process makes it more challenging in some ways. You nor Frankie, do either of you have thoughts on kind of the transparency question going into this final round of negotiations?
Yeah, I can go first. Yeah. So I think I agree with Martin. To increase transparency, there's also an urgent need to declare the free from conflicts of interest, because not only during the process, but also the secretariat, how the conflict of interest of the secretariat untangled from the petrochemical industry, it has to be declared. And for instance, the study that published by UNEP last year, or a couple of years last year, it was done by a consultant which used to work for petrochemical industry. So it's a bit how you call it? It's not neutral, and it has to be free from conflict of interest to give us a very objective background information and references. And then the second, the transparency in terms of participants or delegations. I noticed that last year at the INC for hang on, where is it? At the INC for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 countries have plastic industry as part of their member of delegates. Most of them declared as the real positions in their chemicals or petroleum industry. Like from China, it's from China Petroleum, and then Chemical Industry Federation, and then from Kuwait, they are from Kuwait Petroleum Corporation. However, one country delegates from Indonesia, from one petrochemical industry, and then the bio-based plastic company, were listed as the technical experts of the Ministry of Industry, but they didn't declare their position. So I had a big fight with them because it's really depending on countries how they want to declare their member of delegates. But I think the Secretariat have to have this kind of requirement that member of delegates have to express their real or explain their real positions or status. Not only the member or technical experts for the member states, but their real position. This is to be clear and conflict free from conflict of interest. And then lastly, in the intersessional works, there are limitations of observers and NGOs participations, and more like concentrated only delegates. And this is creating another problem for us because we couldn't follow the discussions because at some point the secretariat said that's an informal, it's not formal, and so on and so on. So no need to have all stakeholders representations in that meeting and so on. But this creates another problem because that discussion in Bangkok, the intersessional works, are mainly dominated by government delegates, which have no idea about technical issues, especially chemicals of concern. And that is concerning because we didn't make any progress by doing that kind of approach. So we would like to see more clarity in terms of how discussions, especially in small groups later, in the contact groups, and then in intersessional work after Busan, how can observers also have a meaningful engagement and involvement in the discussions?
Thank you. It's an interesting example. It's like defining something as informal so that regular stakeholder processes aren't required, but then it's behind closed doors. Frankie, any thoughts on the transparency question?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to absolutely agree with what's been said. I mean, again, as Indigenous peoples, we have not been equitably included in the negotiations, and we worked hard, and we are continuing to work very hard to take up that space and gain access to the negotiations in a more meaningful way. And the intersessional events, like what what you're just saying right now, it's many of us had to find ways through state delegations to attend some of the the intersessional work, and yeah, it's not appropriate. It's not a way of moving forward, and I think that sometimes it's an intentional design by state and by country and industry, where these forms and decisions that directly impact our communities are being made, and it's hard to point out. It's hard to point the finger at a single body, but UNEP, the Secretariat's office, and certain members of the committee have all in various ways made it difficult for Indigenous frontline, fenceline, and environmental justice communities to have a meaningful seat at the table. So yeah, there is no real transparency, and at least not prior before the negotiations start at each INC, and it needs to be addressed and ratified before we go into rectified before we go into the intersessional work between now and between Busan and COPS, right? And then you got implementation, which all those areas are heavily gonna need those that are disproportionately impacted at the table. So yeah, that's all of that. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you for those thoughts. And so I have a question, and this follows up on things that each of you have already said, that so you've all been involved in other UN policy arenas and processes. And what are the things that have been different about the plastics treaty process? And why do you think that is? And Martin, you touched on the sort of streamlined nature of it as one piece, that it's really different because this has moved more quickly. But are there other things to flag that, based on your experience, have been different about this process? And Martin, we'll start with you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think like time indeed is like maybe one major difference that, as I said, like is positive, but also does create some challenges for participation and deliberation, etc. But I think like for me the most kind of striking feature, and it's kind of built into like the mandate of UNEA Resolution 514 is that the stakes are much higher, right? So I'm looking quite a lot at what is going on in the other negotiations at the moment for the Science Policy Panel on Pollution, right? And that's a non-legally binding thing that they're going to negotiate. It's a much friendlier and more constructive conversation happening for the Science Policy Panel over there, and the stakes are much higher the atmosphere is much more aggressive, I feel, for the plastics treaty. And I mean, that's because it's a global commodity we talk about, and humanity is depending or has become dependent on that commodity. Unfortunately, it has a global market volume of about $600 billion, right? So we're talking a lot of dollars here. So stakes are much higher, and that creates all kinds of I think, well, creates an atmosphere where yeah, the pressure is on. We've seen, and that's no big news. We've seen very strong opposition by some countries, by some member states that have really kind of derailed, I think, the whole process quite a lot, not only in wasting a lot of negotiation time, but also in just like cutting out like the strong ambitions that very many countries did have in the beginning. So yeah, and with that, and maybe that's something that I as a scientist find particularly concerning and different from other processes, is really seeing member states using scientific mis or disinformation for their strategies, right? And that hits me quite hard because, well, you're used to that kind of stuff on social media, but hearing it from governments is like, I think, a different level. So I think that was something that I found quite different and striking in the plastics treaty negotiations. But then there's also a positive difference that I really briefly want to mention, and that's that we have like a really large and organized scientific community now that's showing up on these negotiations. And I think that's kind of different from many other environmental negotiations before, and I think that's something that's quite positive. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. Interesting point about the stakes really are different from many other processes. Frankie, what are your thoughts on how this process is different from others you've been part of?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's very few indigenous representatives actively participating in the UN policy arenas. And this, again, it seems to be by design. I remember being at UNEP 6, and we had a member state tell us after having a meeting with them that, you know, that they apologize, that they, you know, that they understand where we're coming from, and that they apologize that these spaces weren't designed for us to be in. These spaces, these kinds of negotiations, these types of tables weren't designed for indigenous peoples and disproportionately impacted communities, sacrifice zoned communities to be a part of these discussions. And so, you know, it's you know, with that said, I mean, our ability to engage and intervene from a place at the table is often greater than it is at the GPT, at the Global Plastics Treaty process, in other UN frameworks, and so we've made it a priority to attend these kinds and types of UN convenings, you know, that would directly or indirectly impact the talks taking place at the INCs. You know, they're all inextricably connected. When you're talking about, you know, the issues of chemicals and the chemicals framework, the nature-based solutions, waste management, you know, all these, you know, other frameworks are, you know, impact. And so anytime you can be in these high-level discussion roundtables or meetings, you know, I think it's absolutely critical for us to be in those rooms and at those tables, to create the uncomfortability that we create because we rehumanize these discussions, because it's been dehumanized, and how they discuss the impacts that it has on human life and the lifespan of our communities, where they've lost 5 to 15 years of their lifespan, you know, where they're dying at 67 years old rather than 80, 90, 100 years old, right? And we've normalized it. And so anytime we can be in those spaces, you know, and again, in the global pastry, it's been very difficult to have that type of engagement. And so yeah, we just kind of prioritize trying to be in as many spaces as possible and taking up as much space as possible, to try to rehumanize the conversations and the dialogues that are happening that impact our communities. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, yeah, reminding those, folks who are making these decisions and negotiating bracketed text and whatnot about what the real impacts of those decisions are going to be on communities around the world is a critical role. So appreciate all the work you're doing. Yuyun, what are your thoughts on how this process has been different from other UN policy arenas you've been part of?
Yeah, thank you, Christine. I've been following a couple of legally binding agreements like Stockholm, Basel, Rotterdam conventions, and then Minamata Convention, and then the non-legally binding recently is the Global Framework on Chemicals. All of this, the chemical and waste conventions have different dynamics. BRS or Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm, they are more specific and targeted chemicals to be regulated and controlled globally and agreed globally. And every year has been progressing because this convention has been ratified and entered into force since the 1980s and 2000. So it's more mature, but also the nature of the convention, especially Stockholm, for instance, looking at specific chemicals, not as a group. But when we are talking about plastic treaty, the chemicals that we are dealing with is not one or two or single chemicals, but it has to be a class or a group. That made the negotiations more complicated because it's involving a group of bisphenols, like it's not only bisphenol A, but bisphenol S, and so on and so on. It's not only PFAS, but all the polychloroform family. So it needs a more robust scientific considerations and inputs, but we see limitations of scientific body to be involved and feeding to the policymakers. But also at the same time, it's a different nature of leadership. We've seen the geopolitical shift, and over a period of time, we've seen more and more repressive political government leading some countries that also lead the country's positions into different stands. One example was the Minamata Convention. During the negotiation process, it was during the Obama administration. And surprise, surprise, the US is actually the first to ratify Minamata Convention because Obama has been briefed by his team and experts and so on that there is a need to have a Mercury Convention. And the US signed up first, surprisingly. So now we don't know whether the US will show the same leadership or not with the new administration. That's also the same thing happened with other countries. Different leadership will lead negotiators to have different stands and different positions. And also to make it more critical is that the development of the climate negotiations also affect the plastic treaty. So that's how it creates more difficult challenges for plastic treaty negotiations because it's interlinked with other conventions. For instance, for plastic waste exports, it has been addressed under the Basel Convention, but now what we are going to deal with at the plastic treaty, because so far it's been dealt with by the Basel Convention. So how far the plastic treaty will agree on countries' negotiations on plastic waste trade. So the most important thing is that following the Global Framework on Chemicals, which is previously known as the Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management, the SAICM, it was rooted or emerged based on the Bhopal accident. In December, it will be 70 years anniversary of Bhopal accident. And that was the industrial accident We don't want that to happen again in other countries, but until now, the issue of the legacy of Bhopal pollution is still there. So the idea to have SAICM, or now Global Framework on Chemicals, is to prevent industrial disaster. But what are we having now? Nothing. I mean, there is no significant progress on that. And to make it worse, it's a non-legally binding convention. So it's what are we doing here? So we are dealing with critical issues, but sometimes we handle it with, relax. Oh yeah, that's a disaster, but oh, let's have a non-legally binding, but we will address it. But there is no punitive, there is no sanctions, there is no punishment if one party or one country do not do what they promise to. So this is the nature of agreements or convention. You can't punish other countries or put sanction if they don't do what they promise to. It's tricky.
Yeah, thank you. That's a critical issue, the question of implementation and enforcement. Also appreciate all of you sort of highlighting the complexity of that landscape of all the UN policy kind of arenas and how they are impacting each other and so on. I wanted to remind folks who are listening in that we are planning to go continue till 1:15, and we have just a couple more questions for our panelists before we open up for Q&A. So thanks to the folks who've dropped your questions into the Q&A box, and if others, I encourage others to do so at this time. So again, just a couple more questions for you all. We talked about, I mentioned the bracketed text, and we know language is obviously key in a treaty process, but both internally in terms of those negotiations of what words are in that final agreement, but also messaging out in the world, right? And how the treaty is being talked about. And I'm curious from your perspectives on what the key issues have been around language in this treaty process. And Frankie, I'll go to you first.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, that's, I'm gonna start off with saying this. I remember being in INC2, I think it was, and plenary had just ended, and someone said to me, "Do you think my bag and my water bottle will be okay if I leave it here while we go get some lunch or get something to eat really quickly?" And somebody else said, and I can't remember her name for the life of me, but she said, it's crazy that we're in this place and there's so much security. It is so safe in here. You can leave your laptop, your iPad, your phone right here on the table, leave for a few hours to go, have something to eat or have another meeting, and come back and know that it's pretty sure it's going to be there on the table, right? That's how much security, how much safety is in these negotiations. However, this is also the same place that one phrase or one word can drastically impact negatively or positively thousands and thousands of people and communities, millions, by just language and the words and the text that is going into these declarations, right? An example is, when we talk about the life cycle of plastics and industry pushing to say that, the life cycle of plastics begins at production to waste, you're leaving out thousands and thousands of communities and peoples by not saying from extraction to disposal, instead of saying from production to disposal. You're leaving out all those communities, fence-line, indigenous, sacrificed communities, from extraction of fossil fuels, which is the feedstock for petrochemicals, for plastics. Can't be made without it, just like plastics can't be made without chemicals. Plastics is fossil fuels and it is chemicals. And, you're leaving out all those communities, from extraction to transportation and the pipelines into communities and backyards of schools that our children go to, all the way to the refineries and the production process, right? And so like that's how crazy, and serious language is, and how important it is in the treaty process. And so our key issues and concerns are how industry continues to co-opt our language and pervert it with concepts that only serve to reinforce their interests. Terms like sustainability and circular economy have been completely greenwashed in these negotiations. When industry talks about sustainable production or a circular economy of plastics, they are talking about sustaining profit motives around plastic production and creating a circular economy of toxic chemicals and fossil fuel based commodities that will continue to endanger and threaten and harm our communities living on the front lines. They poison, it's poison consumers worldwide and push us beyond the planetary boundaries of novel entities, pollution, biodiversity loss, and atmospheric carbon loading. These phrases, sustainable levels, which is so frustrating because they're using a lot of it right now because of what's in the SDGs, right? Sustainable levels of production and consumption, which is harmful. This like plastic circularity, using just transition without stating non-toxic just transition and circular systems imply an acceptable it implies an acceptable amount of pollution or health risk, which overlooks the lived experience and reality of those in frontline communities who already endure heightened cancer rates, environmental degradation, and compromised health due to plastic production. No level of pollution or cancer risk should be deemed sustainable. So, it's very frustrating because I know a lot of this language is being used while, getting in prep for INC5, and those are some of our largest concerns and worries right now. So, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for flagging those issues. Yun, anything from you to add about the issue of language in the treaty, both internal and external messaging? Yeah.
Yeah, can I share my screen? I just want to show you one slide. Yeah, I think I can
Sure.
share it.
You should be able to, yeah.
Hang on. Can you see this?
Yes, we can see it.
This is how it looked like at the INC4. So all the text has been bracketed like this. But if you look at the color there, the red one is the not good for us. The yellow one, or orangey, it's like okay, but it's in the middle. But the green one, that's what we want. So delegates, negotiators at the INC4 added these wordings and then put in brackets. So the compilation text of INC4 will be one of the bases of the negotiations, including the non-papers chair, chair's non-paper. But the chair's non-paper doesn't have this kind of bracketed text. However, these are the compilations of wordings that proposed by delegates that for non-English negotiators, they have to be careful and listen to what was the right word, which one is the stronger one if we want to have it. So for instance, if the word, the last one, listed in part 2 of Annex A, that's for products, presumably. So if it's only that words listed in part 2 of the annex is not strong enough. So what we want to see is based on the criteria contained in Annex A. So within the Annex A, there will be an explanation. So this is applicable to A, B, C, D. That's the criteria applied for Annex A. So these kind of provisions that we would like to see. I'll stop there, but Also, there is a limitation when we go to the contact groups discussion, where all the negotiations and the details in the devil, right? The devil is in the details, because the discussions took place in a smaller group, but not really small, because it's usually hundreds of people involved. However, in these crucial conversations within the contact groups, there will be no translations, English only. So that is the disadvantages for negotiators from non-English speaking countries, because they need to have someone with the English proficiency to be part of that contact groups. But if they have to split the member of delegates into 4 groups, they're pulling each other out. So there's the disadvantages of having the right words putting into the critical groups or the negotiation processes. The lack of translations because of the limitation of the budget and so on and so on. So we'll see that kind of risk of the choice of words that are, will be the challenge, the main challenges in the final negotiation.
Thank you for that little snapshot into the reality of what the brackets, what that means when, you're negotiating bracketed text and what a difference that can make in people's lives, right? Martin, any thoughts on the language question?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, the brackets are an issue. I think like after the last negotiation, we had a text with about 3,000 brackets. So that basically tells us that every single word in the treaty was contested by one or another country. So basically, they managed to put themselves in a position where the treaty is non-negotiable. So that's what we're looking at the moment. Language really does matter, and it's been mentioned like the use of English, not only in negotiations, but also in all the official documents that are not translated, scientific documents that are only available in English, technical documents that are only available in English, really exclude a lot of governments and stakeholders that are not very proficient in English. And I mean, we did bring a lot of French and Spanish speaking scientists into the negotiations really to help these countries understand the science better. And that was something I think that was quite powerful to speak in their own language. One thing I've learned about language is that it's been used with a lot of ambiguity as a negotiation tactic, right? So as a scientist, I always want to have like a very clear terminology, very, very clear definitions of every single term that's been used. And I found it quite confusing that that's not the case. And I believe that might be an issue later on, because there's a lot of different interpretations of all the terms that are being used in the negotiations without clear definitions. And again, that highlights that they do need a lot of technical, scientific expertise to fill these technical terms. And I'm not seeing any kind of clear pathway for how they would get technical experts in to help with these kind of quite difficult aspects. But let's see.
Great. Really appreciate all your insights on that question. So one final question, and then we'll turn to questions from our participants. So we know industry representation and industry representatives are always present in these kinds of international policy spaces. You've each mentioned it in passing in our discussion so far. I years ago was part of Stockholm Convention negotiations, right? And they definitely showed up there, and we're trying to influence the process in various ways. I'm curious your perceptions on how the petrochemical industry has shown up to this plastics treaty process, holding in mind kind of the stakes question, Martin, that you flagged earlier on, that this is a high stakes legally binding treaty. And Martin, we'll start with you for this one.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, there's a lot of at stake, in particular for the petrochemical and plastics industry. So they're probably showing up in force. They're probably exerting their influence on policy making as they usually do. But the issue indeed is that it happens behind closed doors, right? So we really don't know actually what is going on, who's there, who's speaking with which party, etc. And indeed, industry has been very quiet in the public with regards to the negotiations. They rarely speak up publicly there, and that just tells me that they have other means of communicating their needs. So what we've seen over the past, though, is that the presence of lobbyists at the negotiations increased with every negotiation round. With every INC was about double the number of lobbyists than before. We've heard about industry representatives making it even into national delegations, providing them with really privileged access to information and discussions, etc., which is clearly a concern. And what we've seen as well in Ottawa at INC4, the last round of negotiations was a massive PR blitz that many different kind of industry organizations ran, with a lot of campaigns that ranged from plastic saves lives to smear campaigns that suggest that working with we should not work with the UN because it's a totally corrupt system. So you get like the whole range of PR over there. So industry is of course getting more active, organizing informal side events, plastic breakfasts, etc. That included some well-known plastic pollution deniers. So yeah, there's a whole portfolio of stuff that's going on, but again, most of it really happens behind closed doors, and that's of course, I think, concerning from a public, but also from a scientific perspective.
Oh, thanks for that. Frankie, any thoughts on what you've seen in terms of industry engagement?
Yeah, it's yeah, I'm not going to use the words I want to use, but there's been an ongoing effort to address the conflicts of interest, right, in the plastics treaty negotiations. I feel it's primarily led by Indigenous frontline and fence line communities, those that are disproportionately impacted, as well as environmental justice advocates, our colleagues and partners. And these groups have long seen the need for safeguards to prevent the petrochemical industry and all plastics industries, and from all stages and from the full life cycle of the production of plastics, from extraction to disposal, from preventing them from influencing policy in ways that prioritize corporate interest over the health, rights, and environmental protection of impacted communities. For many Indigenous peoples and frontline advocates, a conflict of interest policy is essential to protect the treaty's objectives from industry's influence and uphold its integrity if it ends up becoming a meaningful, not just an ambitious, but a meaningful treaty that seeks real change, right? And so a strong conflict of interest policy for us, could help insulate the treaty process from industry-driven agendas by setting clear boundaries on who can participate in discussions, consultations, and decision-making. Such policy would ensure that the voices of those most affected by plastic pollution, especially Indigenous and fence-line communities who experience the brunt of the petrochemical industry impacts, are not overshadowed, because that is what's happening by these corporate representatives. So yeah, I think an interest policy should include like exclusion of industry actors from key decision-making spaces. It needs to have transparency requirements, representation quotas for impacted communities, and independent monitoring and accountability mechanisms, especially when we get to implementation. So, for Indigenous and frontline communities, such a policy would protect the treaty's focus on human rights, health, and the environment and environmental justice by ensuring that the solutions are implemented genuinely and genuinely serve people and the planet, not profit. And without these protections, industry's interests risk derailing or weakening the treaty, failing those who bear the highest cost of plastic pollution. So I think we need to really look at, how we move forward into the negotiations and making sure that we're finding some binding agreements, not optional, right? Not left in brackets. But yeah, that's what I would say. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for those thoughts. And Yoon, I'll give you the last word on this. I know you mentioned earlier the issue of kind of industry representatives sitting on country delegations without disclosure, that kind of thing. Are there other things you want to add about kind of how the petrochemical industry has shown up to this process?
Sure, Christine, it's not only during the negotiation, but along the processes before and then after and in between, they've been involved since the beginning. And it's very clever move because, as we know, polluters always anticipate this and they know how to pose and embrace, the next turmoil. The interesting one interesting approach is to look at the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, which was established back in 2019 or 18 by many major plastic industry, petrochemical companies. And they appoint the CEO, Jacob Dewar, which used to be he's a former program director at UNEP. He's the CEO of the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, which is funded by the major petrochemical industry to end plastic waste. So it's their mission. They pour a lot of money for projects around the world, hundreds of millions, to tackle the plastic pollution. But they do not want to talk about the upstream or their business, So to do that successfully, they hired a CEO, which is formally the program director of UNEP. We know him very well during the negotiation of Minamata Convention because he's one of the leading figure in the secretariat. We knew him very well during the Minamata Convention. But when he moved to the Alliance, none of us want to talk to him. We just look at him and, it's horrible to see the person that we thought, okay, he's a good guy. But hang on a minute, now he's on the other side. How come? And then he tried to talk to me last time at the INC4, but I'm pretending not to see him because I hate him so much. That's how it works, So how the industry anticipate this to get the smooth negotiations and to get the smooth positions. They created the narratives, and then even there is a website called Recycling is Real because we keep calling IPEN keep campaigning for recycling is a myth, recycling is broken, So they counter our campaign by establishing this a platform called Recycling is Real. So I said, oh, what's real? So you don't talk about chemicals in the recycling in the recycled products. You don't talk about how dangerous it will be accumulated in the next products. Also, there is a new council. I don't know if you know this, Martin. They call it the Plastic Research Council. It's the industry consultants, but they are researchers and experts and scientists. They said they are trying to debunk and all the myth or misinformations about plastic recycling and plastic industry. So it's how they do because they have lots of money. They have more money than God, so they can do whatever they want. But we know they are playing dirty. So it's not only part of the delegates. Oh, and then the head of delegates are from Indonesia. She's also the shareholder of an oil company in Indonesia. So here we go.
Yeah, so it sounds like a combination of kind of showing up in different ways, again, often behind closed doors or in roles that seem to be official, as well as that external messaging, and really investing in that, shifting the public narrative so that chemical recycling is seen as a good thing, for example. Yeah, so We do have a handful of questions from our participants, and so I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to kick us off with our first question.
Sure. Thank you for that excellent panel Q&A. I think I want to highlight this one question about what can US citizens and residents do to help get the Global Plastics Treaty passed? Maybe this could be for just members of the general public, especially with the new Trump administration beginning in January. If anybody wants to tackle that.
Frankie?
Yeah, sure.
Are the US citizen, sorry.
Sure. Yeah. No. I think with the current and the future political atmosphere we're going to be in, I think we need to go into these negotiations, adding as much pressure to the current delegation and the current administration to come into the negotiations, not just in a way that is going to be ambitious but meaningful. They have an opportunity, the current lead negotiators and the current administration, to leave behind something that other states can add pressure to the U.S. to uphold, right? I mean, at this point, I don't really think going into this administration that they're going to ratify or sign on to this treaty. But this is a long process. We have the COPs and we have implementation that's going to follow. And I think that as of right now, we feel that we need to continue to push as much as possible for the U.S. To be as ambitious and as meaningful as possible. It's in our best interest because it's something that other countries can look at. And I know that the U.S. has shifted its position recently on plastic reduction and addressing product reduction issues. Again, I don't know going into this new administration how feasible that's going to be, but again, I think we just need to continue to add as much pressure as possible. Continue to do it. Continue. It's when we stop trying is when nothing happens. And we don't get anywhere. And we need to continue to keep trying, continue to keep pushing. We've seen some of the current shifts, the recent shifts happen because of that push. And regardless of whatever the political environment is, we've been here, we're here, we're going to continue to be here to fight for the most beneficial future that we can for our children and our children's children's, right? So yeah, I just continue to add pressure. We want the most meaningful and ambitious treaty as possible and move forward.
I'll jump in with another question that kind of builds on that. Are there current efforts to strengthen opportunities to work together to strategically increase the capacity of underrepresented voices, science, frontline, fence line, Indigenous, to be an integral part of the work of Global Plastics Treaty and other global efforts? Is there targeted work to eliminate the parties with a high conflict of interest from the negotiations? Anybody want to take that one?
I think that's a good question, and maybe just from my perspective to start with, I mean, we did have to go through the effort of building and pushing the scientific community first, right, which is usually very fragmented, very highly individualized, not very well organized, etc. So I think like that was our priority with the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty, first of all. But I think like the question points towards that more networking is and building alliances with others is dearly needed. But again, it has been a wild ride with that INC process, with that treaty. But I think that's something good that could come out of it for future kind of negotiations as well.
I'd like to add a little bit, Christine.
Sure.
I think the question about is there targeted work to eliminate the parties with high conflict of interest from the negotiation. This is part of the challenges in the negotiation, that the rules of procedures have to be agreed at the beginning of the negotiation, but we didn't have any agreement on the rules of procedures, which is a majority countries, especially the oil producing countries or petrochemical countries, wanted to have it based on consensus. They do not want to have voting. But if it's based on consensus, it will take ages to come into an agreement. And it will depend on the strong negotiator or strong country who have this one position. For instance, if Russia said, no, we don't want that, cutting the plastic production into the treaty, then it has to be agreed by everyone. So they have to lobby and huddle and so on. So it takes hours and hours and years. So the problem now is that we don't have an agreed rules of procedures. That's the danger part of the negotiation.
Yeah, if I can add just a few words to that too. I think Martin hit it a little bit. Yeah, I mean, obviously, to build the capacity and the participation, what I have seen remarkably like be encouraging is how, many different organizations and NGOs and civil society groups have come together to support each other to be more in these spaces, right? And because we can't expect it to come out of the states or out of the UNEP or in these negotiations, and I've seen where there's been a lot more resources being shared amongst the different groups to uplift and to help build more participation in the negotiation. Obviously not enough. We definitely need much more. But yeah, seeing those, like I'm all for, like I don't ever use the words networking. I always say relationship building because it's more meaningful and it lasts longer than just for that period of time. So like building relationships is absolutely critical and important to really, being in these spaces and facing these issues and really building power through that unity in the works to achieve the very thing that impacts all of us, right? All future generations. So that's been inspiring to see, and hopefully that continues to grow. So just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Frankie. And then I think we can end on maybe a hopeful note about what you hope for the final negotiation sessions. And I like this question that asked, if you had a magic wand and could make only one wish for INC5 without personal repercussions, what would it be?
I wish I had a magic wand and I would change so many things about that process, but I can only change one thing. So I think like what my hopes, if I had such a wand, my hopes would be for high ambition countries to get their act together, to push harder, and to make sure that all the key elements that are needed in that treaty are in that treaty. And if that is a start and strengthen approach, as everybody's talking about, I'm okay, but we need to make sure that all the key elements, the crucial elements are there. Plastic production reduction, chemicals of concern, avoidable unnecessary plastics, etc., transparency, and so on and so on. These elements must be there, and it's on the ambitious countries to push for it. And that's what I would hope for if I had such a magical one.
May I? If I have a magic wand, I will say first, stopify. Okay, so everyone froze. And then the magic treaty final text come down to everyone's laptop and they all spell, under the spell, and agree to that, and then bang on. That would be ideal. With the treaty said that, okay, we will cut the production of primary plastics by 30% by 2040, and then eliminate and ban toxic chemicals in plastics, and then address the legacy of plastic pollutions and increase transparency in reporting, in controlling the emissions and releases, and have health addressed as the main treaty objective to protect human and the environment. That's one wand, one spell.
Yeah, so magic wand. Yeah, I just I think I would use it to stop all the, you know, stop all the harm and violence and health, negative health impacts in our communities, while these negotiations are happening, right? Like they fail to realize that while we're talking about preambles and bracketing and this and that, and there's people in our communities disproportionately being impacted and dying in exponential rates more than ever. And so, yeah, I would I'd probably, just use the wand to get rid of industry in the negotiations. But I think we'd be much more successful in negotiations and if they weren't in the room influencing. But in short, for us, I think it's, you know, looking for binding commitments to reducing plastic production, protection and safeguards for human health and the environment, respect and safeguards for indigenous rights and knowledge, and we need a strong conflict of interest policy. We envision a plastics treaty that embodies true environmental justice. Environmental justice doesn't mean to better one community at the expense of another. That is not environmental justice. And, we need to recognize the humanity and rights of indigenous and frontline and fenceline communities. It's rooted in the commitment of a non-toxic just transition. This means moving beyond false solutions like recycling and waste management, towards a systemic change that reduce plastic production and the end of our reliance on fossil fuels. We imagine a world where our children and future generations are not forced to live in the shadows of plastic pollution or petrochemical plants, where the right to a healthy environment, is respected and as a fundamental right, human right, in this vision. And the Plastics Treaty will prioritize a global effort to protect the health of communities and ecosystems and the legacy of environmental racism and empower indigenous and frontline communities to lead the way in shaping a just, toxic, sustainable future. And so ultimately, our vision is for a plastics treaty that serves as a milestone for global accountability, rooted in respect for human rights, equity, and the health of our planet. We hope that the treaty will become a living document that continues to evolve, right? Providing a framework for future action that, puts people and the planet first and dismantles the harmful industries and paves the way for a world free from, toxic legacy of the toxic legacy of plastics and the harm. We continue to say enough is enough, and we can't say that enough. Scientists usually say we need, this needs to be, science based and science led. And I've always said this. What makes science founded is trial and error and recorded history of it. Well, that's indigenous knowledge. We can tell you for generations and generations, what has worked and what hasn't worked. And if we don't, have these negotiations lead with those voices at the table, then we're just going to continue to perpetuate this cycle of a facade, of really trying to address and be meaningful with real substance when discussing the global plastics treaty. So yeah, thank you. That's my answer.
Thank you, Frankie. I'm glad we could end on that note, and thank you so much to all of our speakers for being here, as well as for all your work on the treaty, and we truly appreciate this time to hear from you. I only want to note that a recording of this webinar will be available on our website in the next couple of days, and it'll also be sent to your emails as well. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and we will see you next time.